Hey, what's going on, guys? I'm Sean, and in this video I essentially just want to go over the basics of Lightroom, how you can import your photos, how you can manipulate them using the sliders that you'll see on the right side. They're not as intimidating as they may look, and essentially just go over the editing process of a couple photos just to show you guys or teach you guys how you can use Lightroom to better your workflow and edit some photos. So without further ado, we're just going to dive right into it. I've got Lightroom open already, and I've got a few photos up. So on the left side here, this is going to be your navigation. So this is where you're going to be importing all your photos, organizing your collections, and so on. On the right side, this is going to be where you're going to be manipulating the values to edit the colors, the saturation, exposure, and all that goodness. It's actually going to be up here in the Develop tab, but right now we're just in the Library tab. So what that's going to do is preview a small thumbnail of every single image that you have imported on the left side here. So what we're going to do is import our images. So what I'll always do is, instead of coming up to File and creating a new catalog, you can create a new catalog. Essentially what that's going to do is just give you a blank slate here, so there is no import information. Essentially your catalogs can get rather busy if you've got multiple shoots already imported. So actually, for the sake of this tutorial, we're going to create a new catalog just so we can start completely fresh, and I'm just going to save this to my desktop. We'll call it tutorial and we'll hit create, and we're just going to skip the backup, and what that's going to do is reopen Lightroom in a new catalog. Open here, and here we go. Okay, so once you open Lightroom for the very first time, this is essentially what it's going to look like. So in order to do our first import, you can either come up to the top here and you can go to File and you can import photos and videos. This is great if you want to import just a few photos. Personally, I'm working with full complete shoots, so I'm always importing upwards to 1,000 photos at a time. So I come down here to Folders and I just hit the little plus icon, Add Folder, and I'm just going to import this collection of photos. This is essentially just a random collection of photos from everything that I've taken that I've kind of just been going through and re-editing. So if you've already imported some photos, you'll notice some of them will be grayed out. That's all right. Just make sure this selection here, don't import suspected duplicates, is selected. What that will do is, if Lightroom thinks that you've previously imported that photo, it will stop the import from this folder, but what we want is everything in that folder to be imported. So once that is done, there's nothing else that you need to change here. You're just going to hit import. Now we are working with ARW files, so these are Sony files. This works also with Canon files, and if you want, you can convert them all to smart DNGs. It's up to you. Alright, so now that these photos have imported, what we're going to do is get onto the editing. So up at the top here, we're just going to come over to our Develop tab. Now, when I first import a shoot, actually we're just going to click this drop down. You will see your navigator. This will just allow you to manually edit the position of your photo inside your screen here, your viewfinder. So what we're going to do is, first, when I initially import a shoot, I actually go through them and I will star everything that I like with a 1. So it's sort of like a numbering process to weed out the ones that I'm not a fan of. I'll go through the entire shoot. I'll hit the ones I like, just press 1 on the keyboard, and you'll notice a little star down here. And once you go through and essentially mark everything that you like with a 1, you can come up here to Filters, Rated, and it will give you all the rated photos that you've already marked with a 1. And again, you can come through here and hit the ones that you really like with a 2, sort of like a second pass, and you'll have a collection of your favorite photos. So I do that every single time when I'm importing a shoot, just to stay organized and make sure that the ones that I really like get edited first. So with that said, we're just going to choose a photo here. to use something like this. And what we're going to be doing is, I'm just going to reset all the settings. So this is essentially the raw import. So on the left side here, you're going to see your navigator. We already talked about that. So this is really helpful just to see a small thumbnail preview of what your photo is going to look like. On the side here, you also have your presets. So this is where you will be saving any adjustments that you make on the right side here. You can save those out as a preset. I highly recommend you save these out as presets so it will speed up your workflow dramatically in the end. So over here on the right side, we're just going to be going through these values, essentially what they do, how to manipulate them, and how they affect your image. So the first panel that we have here is the standard slider changers for your highlights, your shadows, your whites, your blacks. And this is very important. Always start here. I never start with something like the tone curve. I always start here. So we're going to make sure that our temperature is right. So you can just drag this slider if you want to make your image warmer or if you want to make your image colder. Now, if you want to make sure that what's white is white, you can actually grab this eyedropper tool and you can come into your scene and select an area where it should be white, and Lightroom will do the best that it can to match that area and make sure that the whites are looking white. So now what you can do is adjust things like the exposure. So this particular image, I think it can be a little brighter. Maybe add a little bit of contrast in here. We can take out some shadows just to bring in some details kind of in here, and maybe lower the highlights just a little bit. With a lot of my images, I tend to flatten them at first using these, and I bring back the contrast within the tone curves. So we can even reduce the whites. You can see that the whites are kind of working a little bit different than the highlights. There are clipping your whites as opposed to reducing the whites and bringing back some detail. Same with the blacks. You can clip your blacks if you would like, but we'll leave it about here. A cool trick you can do, if you're unsure where to start with these values, you can actually hit Control U and Lightroom will do it for you, what it assumes that the best value should be for your photo. I actually genuinely like this, so we're going to leave that. A couple things that it changed that I didn't talk about is the vibrance. So the difference between vibrance and saturation. Saturation, you can kind of think of this as an overall boost to the hue. So if you've got any color in your scene, it's just going to be making it overall a clean slate of more saturated colors or desaturated colors. If you want that black and white look, you can just rip those out, but we will not do that. As vibrance is kind of like saturation, but it works for each individual color. So you'll notice with vibrance, it kind of makes each individual color punchy as opposed to just overall, like an overall wash to the saturation on the image. So just a little bit different, sort of similar, a little bit different. In a lot of my photos, I do like to increase the vibrance. Just adds a little bit of nice touch, especially with skin tones. But next we've got these three sliders here. So our texture, our clarity, and our dehaze. So an example of the dehaze, I think I have filters off. I have a photo here. Right here. So this is a huge, like a perfect example of dehaze. I often find you need it with drone shots, especially stuff like this. It was a very sunny day. This was probably about 12 o'clock, so there's no harsh shadows. Everything is very direct coming down. Sorry, there is harsh shadows, but there's no sunset shadows. And essentially what the dehaze is going to do is remove that hazy feel, and it will bring back all the beautiful colors in your image, kind of like that. So this is, of course, extreme. For a photo like this, you do need to be quite extreme. For something like what we were working on before, I don't know if I'd use dehaze. The trick with dehaze, especially when working on things like portraits, is it can actually accentuate bags under the eyes and other shadow features that can make the person kind of look aged. So I do recommend you just kind of take it easy on the dehaze, but you can use it. I often do like add a very tiny amount to my photos, and I like to reduce the clarity, which you can see here, it kind of adds that dreamy vibe to the photo. A cool thing you can do with clarity is if you actually use a gradient mask. So on a photo like this where the sun's coming from this direction, you can kind of just bring out a gradient mask here and reduce the clarity and bring up the exposure, and it will kind of add this sort of kind of like a faded light effect coming in from the top here. But we're going to delete that for now. I'm going to go over these and exactly what they do in a second. So that's essentially it for the basic color adjustments. These are what you're going to be playing with first before you do anything. So next we've got our tone curves. So this is a rather complicated thing to explain. Essentially the basics of your tone curve is down here you've got your shadows, up here you've got your highlights, and usually what people do with the tone curve is create what's called an S curve. So 3 points like so, and leave it like that. Now if you're going to be doing that, you might have to make some adjustments here, because you'll notice that this tone curve, if you toggle it here, will bring in a lot of contrast. You can also clip your blacks and add that faded look like this. You can see what's going on inside the shadows here. And you can do the same with your whites if you don't want any peaking whites. So we'll just do something like that. You can also manipulate the colors inside the red, green, and blue channel, but we're not going to be getting into that today because this is a little bit more advanced. So far for the tone curve, all you really need to know is the basic S curve. So down here, this is where you're going to notice the biggest adjustment in your photos. So these are the hue, saturation, and luminance sliders. So this is essentially where you'll be controlling the individual color tones of each separate color in your scene. So you can see kind of like this. I'm not going through these meticulously for this particular image. In fact, I think that her skin tones look pretty bad here. That's a little better. And we'll just bring the shadows up. Maybe something like that looks a little better. If you hit Y at the same time, guys, Y will show you the before and after. That's not the before. Something's going on here. Maybe if we go like this. I don't know what's... It's kind of weird. Usually Y will do that if you hit the backslash. Okay, so I think Lightroom has some stored data and it's just kind of messing up at the moment. But an example, if a photo like this, it's still not working. Okay, here. So there we go like this, hit Y, there's before and after. That's what should be happening. I am actually unsure why it's doing this. But either way, we're just going to be back adjusting these. The biggest adjustments you're going to be making are your saturation sliders. This is where you'll get that majority of the moody feel that you see in a lot of people's photos. People tend to kill the greens a lot, some of the blues, and do that moody, desaturated look. I wouldn't recommend doing it here and just overall dragging the saturation down. I do recommend controlling each color individually. And if you're unsure which color is driving what in your scene, you can actually hit this little adjustment here and kind of hover over. You can see on the right side, look at these here, that it is highlighting what color is driving that specific area in your scene. And in some cases, it will even highlight two colors to show you that they are both affecting that. And if you want to, on the fly, make an adjustment, you can actually click and make adjustments to that specific color in your scene. So the last thing we have here is our luminance sliders. Now this is exactly what it says it is. So this is going to be adjusting the luminance or the brightness of each specific color. So we can, we know that the orange usually drives our skin tones, so we can make those brighter or we can make those flatter. We can adjust the colors in the background and essentially fine tune our image so that some things that might be more distractive, you can kind of remove those with our luminance sliders. I also find these are a great help if you've got a sky in your image, something kind of like this maybe. You can see that the blues on our luminance drive the sky, and you can kind of bring back some details in your sky without adjusting the shadows or highlights. So a little bit further corrections you can do just to bring back some details in the sky. So with that said, now we're just going to move on to the next sliders here. So these are split toning, very important sliders. These will give you some very interesting looks in your images. Personally, I use split toning quite a bit in all my photos. I'm just going to bring this down. I think our skin's a little saturated and something like that. So anyways, sorry. So in in split toning, we've got our highlights and our shadows. So essentially what this is adding a specific color to our highlights and to our shadows. Now, what people usually do is just add a little bit of warmth to our highlights and a little bit of cold to our shadows. Now you can already see by pressing this button the difference, and you can get some really moody vibes with the split tone, and you can even adjust the balance if you want to go more to the hot side and more to the cold side, and kind of offset each one of these, and you can control how much of each is being applied. So again, very powerful tool. I definitely recommend playing around with split toning. You can get some really cool vintage vibes going on in your photos. But the next panel is our detail panel. So this is where you're going to be doing saturation and noise reduction. Or sorry, saturation, sharpening, and noise reduction. So we're just going to increase our sharpening. I usually do around 60. And a little trick, if you hold Alt on your masking, you can actually see exactly what it is sharpening. Now this tip also works up here with your exposure and any of these values. If you actually hold Alt on your highlights, so the reason that it's not working right now is because we've actually clipped our highlights in our tone curve here. So if we just zero that out, now if we hold Alt, you can see what's kind of showing down here. I'll use the exposure. You can see what is being blown out white and what is fine. So I'm just going to reduce these, and we're just going to clip that again. So essentially that is it for our detail panel. Noise reduction, rule of thumb on your luminance is to set that to whatever megapixel your camera is. Personally, I use a rather low number, around 10 or 12 if I find it's quite noisy, but oftentimes I don't even use noise reduction. I'd rather add some grain to my photos. But the next section we got here is the lens correction. So we've got remove chromatic aberration. I have this checked all the time, even if there is no chromatic aberration that I can see in my photo, because maybe Lightroom can see some. So I always check remove chromatic aberration, and essentially what aberration is, let me see if there is any in this photo. This one is actually pretty clean. Essentially what chromatic aberration is you might see some sort of magenta fringing coming around, maybe something show here a little bit. These are actually pretty clean, but you might see some magenta fringing kind of around here. It's very prominent when you have a very bright surface meeting a dark surface. So you can kind of see a little bit in here. But these are actually pretty clean. Not much chromatic aberration. I'm actually going to see if I can find one for you guys. Okay, so here is a good example. So this was actually shot on a Canon T7i. So it doesn't have that dynamic range that the Sonys have. And you can see in her dress where the whites are sort of like a magenta fringing and almost like a bloom happening around her. And that is essentially the chromatic aberration. So I always have that checked, and you can even further adjust it inside the manual. So even by just dragging this up, you can see that it's gotten rid of a lot of the magenta in here. But that is essentially what I do if you don't want to go too deep into the manual settings. And the last one is enable profile corrections. This was just shot on a 50mm, so it's just going to essentially brighten up the sides and correct the vignetting. I do notice if I'm shooting on a wide lens, this will actually adjust the frame completely to make sure that bowing in walls is straight. But that is essentially it for our lens correction. We're just going to come back to our default image here. I'll just do it here. So here you can actually see this was shot on a 70mm. I think this was shot on a G Master, so you can see it's kind of correcting a little bit of the sort of distortion that your lens can cause. But aside from that, honestly, I don't check this too much. Mostly I'm shooting with a 50mm, and the only thing it does with my 50mm is correct vignetting. And I find it actually overcorrects the vignetting, so it looks like the edges are sort of overexposed compared to the subject. But that is just me. So the next section here is our transform subject. section. And this is pretty important. I don't use it too much, but you can quickly adjust the images. It will level it out for you. You can transform it, distort your image if you would like. Personally, I don't use this too much, but I do know a lot of people that do. And next we have our effects tab. So this is where you can add your vignetting. Now, if you do the lens profile correction, that's when I do come in here and just add a slight vignette back to it just to correct the overcorrection, if that makes sense. You can also do it by adjusting the vignette setting underneath here. But this is also where you can add the grain. So a nice grain amount that I find is like around like 40, and I just keep these like low. So you can kind of see here, maybe a bigger size around 60, and it adds a nice grain feel to it. But we're just going to turn this off for now. And lastly, we have our calibration. So really quickly, I want to go over this. You can get some amazing effects in your calibration. Now, this is the one setting that does not transfer over to mobile. So if you are editing on mobile, you will not have this data inside Lightroom Mobile. But I'm going to show you quickly how to use it. There's actually a really cool trick that a lot of people do to get that nice teal and orange look in their photos, and that's called the red-blue split. So essentially you just take the reds, drag them to the right, you're going to take the blues, drag them to the left, and you're just going to even it out with your greens. So just kind of even the skin tones to about there. And then just adjust the saturation if you want it more saturated or less saturated. So something about here, and you can see the difference. Kind of makes our skin tones pop. Brings a little bit of the blue back here. It was a cloudy day, so there's not too much blue in the sky. But if you do apply this image to another photo, so for example, I have this photo right here. Lots of blues going on in the background, and if we just apply that exact same technique, this split, something like this, you can already see the difference in saturation in the sky, kind of bringing in that cyan vibe. Watch her skin tones, of course, so maybe something, I think that's in the red, maybe something about there. Bring up some blue saturation. These do take some playing around. You'll just have to play around with the values until you find something that you're happy with. And you can of course combine these with your saturation sliders to reduce and bring in exactly what you want. Or if you want to even make the sky more teal, you can do that. More of a cyan vibe, and the orange look, you can bring that in with the sliders up here. So essentially, guys, that is it for the basic sliders. I just really quickly want to go over what these do. So we've got our crop tool. If you're cropping for Instagram, you're just going to select 4x5, and there you go. The next tool here is our spot removal. Actually, really quickly with our crop tool, if you grab here and just kind of shake it, it will turn sideways. There's probably a better way to do that, but that's how I do it. Next is our spot removal tool. So this one here, you can essentially remove things from your background. This works really well with like blemishes on skin, or if you're trying to clean up a beach. Not so much in this situation, but it is a demo, so you can increase the feather on it. And you can also adjust it from clone to heal. So if we do clone, it's essentially copying what's in here and replacing it here, as opposed to heal, where it's using an algorithm to try and fill in this space. So in this case, we're going to use clone, but in a lot of cases, heal is actually the way to go. Next, we've got our red eye correction, exactly what it says. You're just going to essentially drag this out over top of someone's eyes if they've got that red look to them that you, oh, there goes Lightroom, that you get when the flash goes off. So that will correct that. Next here, you've got your gradient filter. So this is essentially just drag it out to add a gradient filter, and you can adjust your basic adjustments inside here. A new feature inside the new Lightroom is allowing you to actually adjust the hue and saturation of that area as well. And if you want to erase from your filter here, you can just come up to brush, and we've got erase, and you can essentially just erase areas of the mask. You can even just select this, show selected mask overlay, and it will show you what you're doing. So we're just going to delete this for now. And the next one we have is the radial filter. So same thing as gradient filter, but it is a radial. This is actually great if you want to just make your subject kind of pop a little bit. I often do this around my subject and just bring up the exposure, bring the feather up so it's very soft from the middle to the outside, and just kind of make small adjustments if I want to sharpen their face or something like that. The last tool we have here is the adjustment brush. So this is the same as these filters, except you can do everything with your brush. So a little trick, if you make sure auto mask is selected and then go around your subject, Lightroom should do a pretty good job here at only selecting your subject, and then any adjustments you make will be made inside that selection. So you can use a combination of these tools to just kind of affect certain areas of your image. But yeah, guys, that is essentially it for the fundamentals of Lightroom. Just to recap, we went over every single thing on the side here, every panel on the side, what they do, what these sliders do, and how you can manipulate them. We went over how to import into Lightroom, stay organized throughout a shoot, and how we use these adjustments at the top. So I'm going to leave it there, guys. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and I will see you in the next one.